All right, thank you so much. Thank you for dealing with me virtually today. I really appreciate that. And we're going to be talking about weed resistance and some management options as well. Before we jump into it, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge my other weed studying folks with Ag Canada here in the Prairies, Charles Geddes, Sean Sharp, and Julia Leeson. You'll be seeing some of their data and some of their research today as well. In addition to that, I also want to take a moment to thank my technical staff and the summer students and co-op students that I get to work with. Without them, I'm really standing up here twiddling my thumbs without a whole lot to say because they really gave me the data to talk to you about. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the funders of the research program and the research that I've done throughout my career so far. So, what we're going to talk about is a little bit about weeds in Canada generally, as well as some new threats or some movement of existing threats that are concerning, as well as talk about resistance then in the prairies. And I'm going to focus primarily on the prairies because that's where I'm based and it's what I know best. Talk a little bit about resistance in Canada and then move into some integrated weed management discussion. Now, we are really lucky in the prairies to have the prairie weed surveys. This is something that started in the 1970s, and since that time, we've continued the surveys using the same methodology, which means that we're able to go back and then compare all of our results over time and look how things are changing. These were initially led by Gort Thomas and now are led by Julia Leeson, and one of their main benefits is that it allows us to track our weed species over time. So just to give you an idea of the type of information we get from these surveys, this is an example from the 2023 survey in Alberta. So we get our top 25 species in terms of relative abundance and how they relate to one another. So you can see we found chickweed most commonly, followed by canola, then wild oats. So we get that type of information by province. We also get to look at things like species shifts. So here, for example, you can see foxtail barley has increased the most since the 1980s is the first time it showed up in the survey, whereas something like wild buckwheat or wild oats have always kind of been in that top 5. They are just consistently problems versus something like, red root pigweed, which has actually decreased in relative abundance. So we can look at where we're seeing shifts and also look at our management strategies and see how those are interacting with one another. Now, this is another interesting graph that we get from the prairie weed surveys. This is looking at the average weed density in each of our quadrants that we put out when we go in and actually do our counts. And so what you can see is from the 1970s through the 2010s, we actually had a massive decrease in the average density of weeds that we were finding in those quadrats. But what you'll notice is in these last two surveys, we're also starting to creep back up now, just a little bit in terms of our average densities, which may actually be an indication of some of the herbicide resistance issues we're dealing with. So that's the kind of information that you can get from these weed surveys. Now, I just wanted to take a moment and give a shout out to the Prairie Weed Monitoring Network. There's a QR code there for our website where you can find information on these prairie weed surveys, on the herbicide resistance surveys, some of our recent research posters, and all kinds of things that we're working on in prairie weed science. So if you are looking for resources for weeds, that's a great place to check out. Now, I wanted to take a minute and talk about kochia, which is going to come back up a couple of times in this presentation. But again, this is more information that we can get from these prairie weed surveys. So these are actually the maps of where kochia was found in the surveys from the 1980s on. And so the darker blue it is, the more dense or the more frequent it was that we were finding kochia in those areas. So in the 1980s, you can really see how dense it was in the southern part of the province. Then we actually see a little bit less kochia in 1997, sort of that similar starting to get dense in the early 2000s and through here. But what I want you to focus on is actually the movement of kochia. So if you look back here where we're just really in this southern portion and those lower ecoregions, now we're all the way up to the east of Edmonton, over into Lloydminster, all the way up through Stettler, and all the way up into central Alberta. So kochia is one of those weeds that these weed surveys are able to tell us is moving. And that is reflected in what we're hearing from farmers and producers in our region as well. And that is across the prairies. So not just in Alberta, but in Saskatchewan and Manitoba as well. Some of these typically southern weeds like kochia are starting to move and starting to be more of a threat across the provinces. Now, one of the things that is really interesting is talking to producers that have not typically dealt with something like kochia, Because when you bring up kochia as a potential threat, they go, well, no, kochia is a southern weed only. This is something I run into quite a lot in Lacombe because we have not typically had kochia. But at this point, I'm really, really forced to disagree about it being a southern weed. These couple of plants right at the front, those are kochia, but all of this green shrubbery along the tracks is also kochia. Those of you that have met me in person might be going, well, Breanne, you're not that tall. It's really not that impressive of weed. It's still an over 6-foot tall kochia with more than its fair share of seeds. So it's no longer just a southern weed. We're in central Alberta. It's moving north. How far north do you ask? Well, it's been found in the Peace region. Okay, so we had some kochia plants that were found in Grande Prairie and in Wanham. Now, the ones in Grande Prairie were a little bit smaller. They were producing, somewhere around that 20,000 seeds per plant. The ones in Wanham were variable in size, and so we're anywhere from, that 10,000 seeds per plant up to over 100,000 seeds per plant. So there's sometimes this idea that, it's more of a southern weed. It won't be very competitive or produce very many seeds when it's out of its normal environment. Unfortunately, not so much the case. When this weed is getting established, it is proving to be problematic. One of the reasons we've been concerned about it is often moving with herbicide resistance. Other weeds that we're concerned about moving in would include things like the pigweeds, waterhemp and Palmer amaranth. Again, these are often considered southern U.S. weeds. These are maps from Manitoba. This is the 2023 map by municipality in Manitoba for waterhemp. In 2024, it shifted further west and closer to the Saskatchewan border. Palmer amaranth was only found once so far in Manitoba in 2021. We believe that infestation was eradicated. It hasn't been seen since, but there's concerns, right? We know these are big competitive pigweed plants. They produce a lot of seed and they're often coming in with resistance. Now, again, I often hear it's a southern U.S. weed. We're not that worried about it. Just for a little bit of information, I guess, both waterhemp and Palmer amaranth have been found in Ontario. They've both been found in Manitoba, although, as I said, Palmer seems to have been eradicated. Palmer amaranth was found in Washington State. Both waterhemp and Palmer have been found in Idaho, as well as Montana, as well as North Dakota. Now, weeds don't like to play fair. They don't necessarily stop and show their passport at the border crossing. They just mosey on over with the wind, or with waterfowl, or with animals, or with equipment. So understanding some of these threats that exist and what threat they could pose to our cropping systems is also really important. And these are two that are really concerning to me. Now, as I said, a lot of times these weeds are coming in with herbicide resistance. We really don't need any more of that. We got our own problems as it is. And so let's talk about those problems that we already have. Now, again, we are very lucky to have the prairie herbicide resistance surveys. The last sort of fully completed survey was from 2014 to 2017, which was led by Dr. Hugh Becky. Most recently, we are just completing another round of the surveys, which was led by Dr. Charles Geddes out of Ag Canada Lethbridge, and you get to see some of those results today. We're only going through a snapshot of them, but there's lots more maps and a lot more information coming out of those surveys right now. In addition to the prairie herbicide resistance surveys, which are done pre-harvest, we also have post-harvest surveys, which are done for things like kochia or for Russian thistle, plants where a lot of times those seeds aren't mature until after harvest. These are going to start getting bundled in with the prairie herbicide resistance survey, but the last fully complete one was from 2018 to 2021, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Alberta 2021 data just as a bit of a reference. So in terms of where we're sitting in terms of herbicide-resistant weeds, we're third globally for how many we have. Ahead of us are Australia and the US. So we get the bronze medal, which I don't think we really wanted, but it's where we're sitting. We've got about 86 herbicide-resistant weed biotypes in Canada, and we find about 2 new biotypes every year. So we're continuing to add and continuing to increase. So as I mentioned, the most recent round of the herbicide-resistant weed survey in the prairies was completed from 2019 to 2023. We sampled about 827 fields with over 3,000 seed samples from weeds. And you can see on the black dots there across the map that we really tried to cover the vast majority of those cropping acres across the prairies. And it takes a huge amount of manpower and collaborators to do this work. And we're always grateful for the collaboration amongst the provinces. In terms of percent of fields, what you're seeing here on the top right is the percent of fields that had a herbicide-resistant weeds from the surveys in the early 2000s, then just before 2010, then the mid-2010s, and then the most recent survey. And so what you can see is, not surprisingly, the percent of fields with a herbicide-resistant weed continues to increase each time we do this sampling. So at this point, when we look, about 72% of tested fields, so where we had weeds that we were able to test for resistance, had a herbicide-resistant weed, and 70% of all the fields that we sampled had a herbicide-resistant weed in it. That equals out to a patch area of about 24.6 million acres and a total field area of over 49 million acres that has a herbicide-resistant weed somewhere in that field. So we're not talking a small amount of land here either. What is the cost of herbicide resistance? Well, this includes things like yield losses, increased costs for weed management strategies, quality losses in the crop, cleaning seed to get weed seeds out of it, all that type of thing. It's estimated that herbicide-resistant weeds cost prairie farmers about $658 million per year in dealing with them. This is just to show you which species we were typically finding and able to collect samples of. So in terms of our broadleaf weeds, kochia was our most common broadleaf weed, followed by lamb's quarters, wild buckwheat, Canada thistle, and spiny sow thistle. Now again, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about kochia because I'm going to talk about that in the separate post-harvest survey. For grasses, wild oat was most common, followed by green foxtail, barnyard grass, foxtail barley, and yellow foxtail. So what did these resistance profiles look like? We're going to start by looking at it as a percent of the tested fields. So in those fields where we were able to find that seed and test it, how many of them were resistant? You can see over 75% of the fields that had wild oat tested were resistant to group 1s, around 50% for green foxtail and yellow foxtail, as well as for group 1 and 2 resistant wild oat. Kochia group 2 resistance is very, very high. Group 2 resistance in wild oat, spiny sow thistle, false cleavers, all around that 50% mark. Now, this is somewhat misleading to an extent because we don't find these weeds in every field, right? This is where we did find them. We were tending to find high levels of resistance, but what does that mean across all of those 827 fields where we actually found them? So this is across all fields. 46% of the 46% of all of our fields had a group 1 resistant wild oat. A quarter of them had group 1 and 2 resistant wild oat, and just over a quarter had group 2 resistant. You can see about a third of it had kochia, but again, a lot of the times when we were collecting kochia, we weren't actually able to test it because those seeds weren't mature. The other group 2 resistant broadleaves and grasses here with yellow foxtail are not as common, but where we have them, they can provide a significant management issue. So across all fields, there may be a smaller problem. If you're one of those farmers that has them, you probably are not a big fan of them. Spending a little bit more time on herbicide-resistant wild oat. It's our most common resistant grass weed. You can see across the prairies here a map of where those samples were taken. Now you'll notice the black dots are where we had susceptible wild oats. Most of those black dots are found in Saskatchewan, which was the earliest surveyed province between 2019 and 2020. So we've now had another 5 years of selection. I'm really interested to see how those numbers shift in Saskatchewan with our next round of surveys. Alberta also had some susceptible dots. There were no susceptible populations collected in Manitoba. If we collected wild oats for sampling and we were able to test them, they were resistant to something in Manitoba. Okay, so resistance is becoming very challenging when it's this prevalent. So when we look at our tested fields, 85% of our tested fields had group 1 resistance, 50% had group 2 resistance. And a lot of times when we have group 2 resistance, we are seeing that in combination with group 1 resistance. So we're seeing multiple resistance occurring. In terms of all fields, 46% of all fields with group 1 resistance, about a quarter with group 2 and group 1 and 2 resistance. So a significant challenge for our prairie producers for sure. Switching to talk a little bit about kochia. Now, the first example of glyphosate-resistant kochia was found in 2011 in southern Alberta. In 2012, there was a survey that was conducted to try and figure out how widespread was this biotype of kochia, and it was about 5% of our populations. 5 years later, there was a follow-up survey done to see how far it had spread, and we were already around 50% of our populations. So from 5% to 50% in about 5 years. An additional 4 years after that, 10 years after the original finding, and we were about 80% of our populations showing glyphosate resistance in kochia. That's not to mention our group 2 resistance, which in most cases we typically don't even test for in a lot of cases with kochia anymore because we can't find any that are not resistant. So we just assume it is resistant because it more than likely is. In the 2017 survey, we also started documenting dicamba resistance, which is a group 4 product. And in 2021, we have group 4 resistance, which covers off dicamba and fluroxypyr resistance. So 2 different group 4 products, indicating that management of kochia is getting more and more complicated. And as we already mentioned, it's moving and more people are having to figure that out. Just another visual of glyphosate resistance. Basically on the right-hand side, the more red it is, the more of those populations in that county were found with glyphosate resistance. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing is the darker red the dot, the more, the higher percentage of resistance was found in that population. So if you had a population where 100% of those individuals were resistant, that's your darkest red. If it's a lighter pink, that means between 1 and 20% of the individuals that were tested in that population were showing resistance. So there's still some of those individuals that can be controlled by glyphosate, but you've got resistance developing. And what you've probably noticed from the 2012 to 2017 to 2021 is that kochia resistance spreads quickly. It can move its seed really easily by tumbling, and it also likes to share its pollen. And so movement of resistance genes is not very challenging for kochia. So it moves quickly when we have it occur. Fluroxypyr resistance in Alberta is not as common. And you can see that here. We don't have as much of the dark red, but again, it wasn't found as long ago as the glyphosate resistance. So we do expect this to also spread relatively quickly in our populations. Dicamba resistance is the least common. And you can see here that a lot of that resistance is lower or moderate level resistance, not high level resistance. So we are still getting some activity from dicamba, but we do have resistance occurring, developing, and again, we do expect that to spread. Some other new resistance in Western Canada that we found in the last couple of years. In 2021, we confirmed glyphosate-resistant downy brome, so another grass species that can be problematic, particularly in the south, but now with glyphosate resistance. Group 1 resistant foxtail barley, and then at the bottom there is PPO inhibitor or group 14 resistant kochia. So this is one of our newest concerns with kochia. This is just a visual from Charles that shows the dose response here. So in the front, 2 sets of pots, we have susceptible populations as comparisons. And what you can see is there's really not many alive after this pot in those populations. The resistant population, on the other hand, way down here, we still have a plant happily growing at our highest rate, which is about usually 32x or so of the field labeled rate. So way higher than labeled and still happily growing. That's a bit of a concern. Luckily, so far, we only know of 2 populations of group 14 resistant kochia at this point in time. But again, knowing what we know about kochia, that's expected to spread. If we broaden out our perspective a little bit to resistance in Canada, lamb's quarters is one that is a significant issue, particularly in the Maritimes. There's other incidents of resistant lamb's quarters as well, but especially in the Maritimes, this is sort of enemy number 1 out there for my fellow wheat scientists. Canada fleabane is another one. Powell amaranth. Powell amaranth is an interesting one. It's also called green pigweed. In Ontario, there are significant instances of multiple resistance in Powell amaranth, and it can be hard to control in the US as well. A lot of our prairie farmers may not realize that we actually also have Powell amaranth or green pigweed. The picture on the right here is a picture from one of my research plots where we've actually got red root pigweed here in the back and Powell amaranth here in the front. So what you can see is if you're not looking closely, it's very easy to just, it's red root pigweed, nothing to worry about. But we actually do have 2 species growing here. and they can have very different resistance profiles. So spending some time getting to know that biology of your weeds can be really, really important to make sure you're actually knowing what you're dealing with. A couple other species that are commonly problematic in Canadian agriculture, common ragweed and giant ragweed, as well as Italian ryegrass, which was also recently identified with glyphosate resistance in Ontario. So what's the big deal with herbicide resistance? Why is this such a big concern? Well, obviously you get poor control when you've got herbicide-resistant weeds with that herbicide that it's resistant to, which results in vegetation growth. So you get reduced crop yields, you get more vegetation that can be a problem at harvest, you get contamination of your harvest samples, all of those kinds of things. You also get seed production of that weed, which means not only is it a problem for you this year, it's going to be a problem for you next year, and it severely limits your options moving forward for herbicide management. Now, I wanted to take a moment to talk about integrated herbicide management versus integrated weed management, which are sometimes confused. A lot of times when we're talking about weed management, our discussion veers into making sure you're tank mixing, making sure you're using a pre with residual followed by a post, or a layering strategy, or a two-pass system, however you want to call it, using multiple effective modes of action. And while those are all really good, really wonderful strategies, they are not integrated weed management because they are all chemically based. Okay, so just making sure we separate that a little bit in our minds. Good strategies, still not IWM. But let's talk about chemical management here for a moment. And how do you do this in forage seed crops or in turf seed crops? Right off the bat, your hands are tied to a large extent because there is not the same amount of herbicide options available as there are in other crops, right? So using multiple effective modes of action, that'd be great if you had multiple effective modes of action registered in those crops. That's often not available. So how do you utilize some of this then in your crops? In those turf or forage seed crops, making sure you use the products that you can, and that when you can tank mix or use multiple effective modes of action, you actually do so, using that as much as you can where you're able to in those crops. But if you can't do that in your crops, it becomes more critical that you use these tools in rotational crops to try and keep your weed numbers down before you go into the turf or the forage seed crop where you have limited options. The other aspect to that is not only do you use these tools in rotational crops, but you use them as effectively as possible. So if you've been talking at all about fertility or thinking about fertility on your farm, you've probably heard of the 4 Rs of fertility management. I've come up with sort of 7 Rs of chemical weed control, and they're just best management practices, things to think about to make sure you get your bang for your buck out of that herbicide application. So we're going to go through each of these quickly, but in a little bit more detail. Right product. Is it the best product for the weed you're targeting? When did you use it last? Because if you used it last year and the year before and the year before and the year before, I'm going to suggest it might be time to look at a different product. Will it control your resistance profile? Do you know your resistance profile? And if not, then maybe we need to be having a discussion about resistance testing. Because if you don't know if it's going to work, you're gambling now with your money for that herbicide application. Right timing. How big is the weed you're trying to control? So weed size, and we're going to talk about that more in just a second. What's the label stage for controlling the weed? Is it the right time of year? Are you going to get more efficacy out of a fall application versus a spring application? What are your temperature or your weather conditions? So let's go back to size for just a minute. Labels vary greatly in size for application, even if they're working on the same weed. So we're going to focus on kochia here for a moment. Some of our herbicide labels use leaf number, and some of them use height. But even within height, there is a massive amount of range. We've got 5 centimeters here for dichlorprop 2,4-D. We've got 15 centimeters here for glyphosate. Those are very different sizes of kochia. But if what you're used to is using heights, then you're dealing with something like bromoxynil, which is 1 to 4 leaf stage. Here's 2 very little kochia plants. The one on the left has between 4 and 6 leaves. The one on the right has 10 to 12 leaves. They're both about 2 centimeters in height, but only one of them is actually even close to label stage for bromoxynil, right? So if we are actually using leaf stages, you can't just in your mind swap that to a height and assume that that actually is a direct link, because it depends how that weed's been growing and how the environment has affected whether or not it's really growing as a rosette or if it's grown taller, okay? Just something to think about. Other BMPs, rates. Some herbicides have different rate structures for different species. Make sure you're using the rate for the species you're trying to target and for the crop that you're growing. Use full rates. There was a point in time where there was a lot of interest in cutting herbicide rates for environmental benefits, for cost savings. We no longer recommend that because it seems to actually increase selection for metabolic resistance, which is worse than our other types of resistance because it can be to multiple herbicide groups. Use full rates. Right partners, and I'm going to try and control myself from ranting too much here. Are you using multiple modes of action or are you using multiple effective modes of action? They are two different things, and herbicide marketing has really messed with the understanding of that a little bit. A lot of our herbicide products are marketed as herbicide resistance management tools or herbicide resistance strategy. They focus on multiple modes of action. But unless both of those active ingredients are working on the same target, you're not getting multiple effective modes of action, which is what you actually need to help manage and prevent resistance. Having two partners in the tank to extend your weed spectrum to get more weeds in that tank mix is still a good thing, but it is not a thing that will help you prevent or delay resistance. Okay, so a tank mix partner does not mean they're both effective on the same species. Getting off the soapbox now. Right weather. Is it dry? Is it hot? Has there been a drought? Do you know how that could affect your herbicide application on your weeds? What is there rain in the forecast and what is your rain fastness of your product? Has there been frost or cold nights? Are those weeds even actively growing? Now, I know a lot, the right area. Are you applying to where the weeds are? And this comes into play with the movement of some of the weeds that we're looking at with things like kochia. Do you have permission or ability to apply where the weeds are? Is it on an oil lease? Is it along rail tracks? Is there something else you can do just besides spraying to prevent those weeds from moving into your field, right? Things to think about. Can you actually get to those weeds? And if not, how are you going to manage them otherwise? Right application. Aerial versus ground versus drone. To date, there is only one herbicide that I am aware of in Canada that is registered for application by drone, and it is for industrial vegetation management. If you are applying herbicides with a drone in your crops, it's an illegal application, and it is really, really, really recommended that you don't continue doing that. Okay, it is not a legal application. We don't have the parameters all figured out. We don't have the label figured out for how to apply those products properly with a drone. Moving on from that, are you using the right nozzle type or droplet size for the product that you're working with? Do you have the water volume you need to get the coverage you need to actually get activity? Water volume is really, really important if you're dealing with a contact herbicide. Now, I do understand that these things seem simple. They seem very straightforward and don't seem maybe worth having this discussion or having the reminder about, but they're crucial for herbicide applications that are actually going to help us and not hurt us in our fight against weeds. And I get some pushback sometimes on when I talk about tank mixing or multiple effective modes of action and the price that's going to be involved in that. And unfortunately, the most expensive herbicide is the one that doesn't work. So if we're not doing some of these things and we're selecting for more resistance, we miss that we've got resistance developing and you go out and make an application and it does nothing. That's a whole lot more expensive in the long term in your yield loss and in the situation you're now in trying to manage than tank mixing or using multiple effective modes of action 3 years prior. Now, the last sort of soapbox here, well, probably not the last one, but one of the last ones, if you're trying to spray your way out of herbicide resistance, all you're doing is running on a treadmill, okay? If we get a brand new in-crop wild oat herbicide, everybody's going to switch to using the brand new in-crop wild oat herbicide, and the selection pressure is going to skyrocket. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have new herbicides. We absolutely should. We need them. They're incredibly useful tools, but we can't expect a new herbicide to solve the problem. If everyone switches to using the new herbicide, 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to be back here talking about the same thing with resistance to now herbicide Z also showing up in the surveys, right? You can't solve a problem the way it's made. You can't spray your way out of herbicide resistance. So then going back to integrated weed management, we've talked a little bit about the chemical management. What about biological, cultural, physical? How can we incorporate these into our cropping systems? Being completely honest, biological weed control is really difficult for producers to do right now with what's on the market, both in terms of the number of options that are available and the consistency sometimes of some of those options that are available because we're dealing with living organisms. They're an extra level of challenge, right? It is a significant area of research, and as resistance continues to increase to the herbicides that we have, and consumer preferences and market preferences for herbicides continues to decrease, it's an area that is an expanding market, in my opinion. It's an underutilized tool right now, and it does need market development, not only number of products, but products that are economical, products that we can formulate easily, products that we can easily apply, and products that are going to consistently work. Those are challenges that we face with bioweed control. It's an area that we need to be looking at. If someone could come up with a biocontrol for kochia that you could spray in crop and actually manage all of our multiple resistant kochia, you'd have a good market there, right? Our markets are changing and the value proposition of bioweed controls have changed with the continued evolution of resistance. So what the heck else are we supposed to do? Well, here's some ideas from the cultural side of things. Increase your seeding rates. Use competitive crops. Use barley versus wheat. Use a winter cereal versus a spring cereal. Winter cereals are more competitive as long as they have a good overwintering and a good establishment. Adding strong basic agronomy. Fertility. Feed your crop, not the weeds. Managing other pests so that your crop is as competitive as it can be. Again, seeding rates, seeding depth, seeding speed, all of those things are crucial to establishing a crop that is highly competitive with the weeds that we're having issues with. I wanted to share a couple other things. We're going to jump into research here. Cultural controls, again, they're underutilized, and there are real barriers that are part of the reason for that. Some of it is cost, some of it is market, some of it is knowledge, and I'll talk about knowledge in a minute. But there are some areas that it can be easily implemented and it can be very effective. So again, jumping into some research here. This is looking at crop type and variety. This is a study that I have ongoing right now where we're looking at, can we actually provide producers information on which varieties of wheat and barley are competitive? Because we tell them, use a competitive variety, but there's nowhere for them to actually access that knowledge of which varieties are competitive. So this is something that we have ongoing. Now, I also want to talk about crop type. So I will often recommend using barley instead of wheat because it's more competitive. And I will hear, is it really that big of a difference maker? So here is the barley study where we are looking for competitive varieties. And what you're looking at here is a weed-free part of a rep and a weedy part of a rep. Weedy part, weed-free part, okay? And you can see, yes, there are weeds in the weedy part, but there's not a whole lot of them. We have the same trial in wheat. We seeded the weeds, the same seeding rates, the same day. There was about 16 hours difference in seeding time between the barley and the wheat. This is the wheat study. Can you find a couple of weeds perhaps in the weedy area of the wheat variety in the wheat study? Massive difference in terms of weed biomass, weed size, and weed number between these two trials. Now, I do hear, well, these pathways are sprayed out, those pathways are not sprayed out. That makes this one look even way more green. So I blacked them out for you, and nope, it's just really still a whole lot greener on the wheat side. Okay, I'm not saying you shouldn't ever grow wheat, but if you're looking for a cultural strategy and you're in a position where you have very limited herbicide options in managing a weed pest, using barley is more competitive than wheat is. Okay, and it's a real thing. This is some research that I really like to show that was done by my predecessor here at Ag Canada, Neil Harker. Again, looking at cultural controls. So he had continuous barley versus a diverse rotation of barley, canola, barley, pea. Two different varieties, a short variety versus a tall variety, where tall varieties are typically more competitive, a 1x or a 2x seeding rate, so an increased seeding rate, and then a quarter, a half, or a 1x herbicide rate. This is in that era where we were more interested in cutting herbicide rates. Right now, we're going to say a quarter herbicide rate just meant that we had herbicide-resistant weeds in that particular rotation. I just want to show you the impact on wild oat biomass. So this is after 5 years, this is wild oat biomass at maturity at the quarter X herbicide rate. So we're relying primarily on the cultural controls here. In the barley rotation, this is what the wild oat biomass looked like. So about 1,500 kg per hectare in the short variety with the low seeding rate. When you go up to the tall variety, the competitive variety with the increased seeding rate, you've taken that down to 288 kilograms per hectare. So a massive decrease in biomass by using a different variety, and using different seeding rates. If you add a diverse rotation into that, you start off with half the biomass and you end up at 82 kilograms per hectare from 1,500. Okay, a massive decrease in wild oat biomass. Now, Neil nicely put this into a sort of 1, 2, or 3 factor table. So if you do one of those things, up your seeding rate, choose a competitive variety, or rotate your crops, you can reduce your wild oat biomass by 2 to 3x. If you do two of those things in combination, you can reduce your wild oat biomass by 6 to 8x. If you do three of those things in combination, you can reduce your wild oat biomass by 19x by using only cultural controls. They really can have a big impact. Physical weed controls, there's a massive number of them of different shapes, forms, varieties. Mowing to prevent seed set. Tillage, does that fit in your system? Are you a conservation tillage person? Does it fit with the weed that you're trying to control? Something like wild oat actually lasts longer in the seed bank if you bury it deeper. There's things like electrical weeding or weed clipping, which is an example that I have on the right here. There's things like harvest weed seed control. Few of you have probably heard me talk about this before. This is the original Harrington seed destructor, where the idea is you take the chaff out the back of the combine, put it through a mill, and pulverize it. Now, don't worry. This is essentially now just the research version. No one else but me has to deal with the giant dinosaur of a beast on the back of the combine. This is what impact mills look like now. They do the same thing. They process the chaff. They destroy the weed seeds in here. We've got 3 different versions online: the integrated Harrington seed destructor, the Redicop seed control unit, and the seed terminator. Again, all built back into the backs of the combines. Limitations to this type of thing, it's price tag. These things are in the realm of 100 grand. So if you're a smaller farmer or if you have an older combine, that maybe isn't going to fit. But this is not an area that is static. It is a continually growing and improving area of weed management. So smaller combines are lower cost. We've got things like the Tech Farm Weed Hog, which is being designed. It's another type of mill being designed specifically for smaller class combines. We've got Global Neighbor Inc., who is bringing out a prototype of something using directed energy to kill the weed seeds instead, again, targeting smaller combines or looking for a lower price tag. So it's not a static area of agriculture. There is massive shifts and massive changes happening in this area of weed management at this point in time. So physical weed control, what I really want to get across is there are options besides traditional tillage. You don't have to just revert all the way to traditional tillage to manage weeds using physical weed control. Which one makes sense for you is going to depend on what works on your farm, in your system, with your wallet, and with your values. Okay, so I can't say this is the one we recommend because everyone is in different cropping systems. Everyone has different values or a different willingness to pay a different price. But what I do want you to remember is this is not in any one year alone. Okay, so if your forage or turf seed crop is crop B, and you can only do so much in crop B because that's just how that crop is produced, that's all the herbicide options you have, those types of restrictions, I guess, try and increase your integrated weed management strategies in crops A, C, and D in your rotation. Okay, try and use those other crops to get your weed numbers down so that those tactics that you are using in crop B don't have as much selection pressure, aren't being put onto as many weeds. Herbicide resistance is a numbers game. So the more you can keep that population low in the crop phase where you don't have a lot of choices, the better off you're going to be long term. I wanted to revert back to some of those herbicide BMPs and also thinking about this time frame and go back to that weed size. So this is some work that Sean Sharp did looking at kochia height at the time of application and the escape risk. So we're going to focus on this left-hand graph right here. Basically, as the plants get taller at the initial application, there is a higher risk of them escaping, so showing some damage, but still surviving and producing seed. If that plant produces seeds, it means that it was exposed to a sublethal dose of that herbicide. It wasn't enough to kill it, that plant still produced seeds. What we're seeing in the weed science literature is that a sublethal dose increases the long-term risk for developing metabolic resistance. Metabolic resistance can go across multiple herbicide groups at the same time with selection only from one. Okay, so it's a very concerning type of resistance. So not only are they producing seed, so not only did you lose yield this year, you didn't get control this year. They're producing seed and going to be next year's problem too, but you're also losing a shot of herbicide, which long term could lead to non-target site resistance. Okay, so a miss in 1 year has implications this year, has implications next year, and it has implications potentially 5 or 10 years from now. What I'm saying is size really does matter for your time frame and your sustainability of herbicide resistance, okay? These little things, these little small mistakes or issues can lead to issues not only this year, but down the road. Herbicide resistance is a numbers game. That blowout weed, disaster, control year, whatever you might have in 1 year increases your risk for resistance in every other year because now you're dealing with more and more numbers. The more weeds you're playing against, the less likely you are to win long term. And it's a long-term strategy, not just here and now. So sometimes when we're talking about something like harvest weed seed control, we're focused on the seeds we're putting back in the seed bank, not because it's going to help our yield this year. That's already gone, that's already passed. Now we're focused on next year and 2 years from now, right? Now we're focusing long term. One thing I wanted to bring up in regards to this, I see it a lot where we have a weed disaster, we have a miss, we have a mess. And it's like, it's okay. I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to just use glyphosate in my burn off and we'll clean it all up. I just said resistance is a numbers game. The more weeds we have that we're applying a herbicide to, the more selection pressure for resistance with that product. Glyphosate resistance is increasing. And the more that we just try and clean up with glyphosate, the more glyphosate resistance we're going to see. Do we really want glyphosate-resistant wild oats? I sure don't. But that's the type of thing that we're putting at risk by just going, it's okay, we've still got glyphosate, it'll clean everything up. All we're doing is selecting for more glyphosate resistance. So I did just want to put that out there when we have that cleanup mindset. It's really kind of scary as a weed scientist. A couple of resources I just wanted to share. Again, the Prairie Weed Monitoring Network. That QR code is there again. It's prairieweeds.com. Great place to look for the survey information. The Resistant Wild Oat Action Committee also developed a large number of infographics. If you're interested, the one on the right is probably our most famous one, using Elvis as a weed identifying tool for wild oat. But all of our infographics, including how to interpret resistance test results and all of that type of thing, not specific necessarily to wild oat, can be found at weedscience.ca/wild oat action committee. And finally, if you're interested in sort of the international perspective on herbicide resistance, what other countries are dealing with, what species are resistant internationally, if you go to weedscience.com, that is our international survey of herbicide-resistant weeds. With that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm hoping I've left some time for questions. If not, I'm available pretty much everywhere on social media and my email's there. I love talking about weeds and love answering questions if there are any. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Does anyone have any questions? I can relay them through the mic. Okay, he had wild oats in his canola and he sprayed at the 1 leaf stage and the wild oats grew through that. So is he breeding resistance?
So one of the issues with just trying to figure it out from something like that is not always understanding what the environment was like. So if you were in drought conditions, sometimes those drought conditions can really have a big impact on how well herbicides work, right? Things like that. Your best bet would be to collect seed and send it into a seed testing lab to get resistance testing done. For something like glyphosate resistance, that would actually go to Charles at Ag Canada in Lethbridge, where he'll screen for novel types of herbicide resistance, like glyphosate-resistant wild oat. Any other, ones that we're aware of occurring would just be to a commercial seed lab. Having said that, we have not yet seen glyphosate-resistant wild oat in Western Canada. We don't know of any occurring. There was concern about some in Australia. It sounds like those are maybe not fully resistant. It may have just been some of the techniques for testing, is my understanding, although I'm not fully aware of all of the situation there. But best bet is to look at getting resistance testing done to know what you're dealing with.
Thank you very much, Breanne.
Thank you.